Good afternoon. Welcome to our international speaker series. My name is Angela Zhang. I'm the director of the Center for Chinese Law. Today, I'm very happy to welcome two distinguished speakers to present their latest book. And we have Professor Anthea Roberts from the Australian National University. Her first book is International Law, have won numerous awards, and she has been named the world's leading scholar by the League of Scholars. And we also have Professor Nicolas, an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at Queen's University, Ontario. He was previously a dispute resolution lawyer at the WTO and also has published widely on international trade lawmaking. And they're going to come and present their latest book, 6 Faces of Globalization, to us today. This is a really exciting new book, and it has also won a lot of awards, has also won a lot of praises, and most recently been named one of the best books of the year by Financial Times and Fortune. And I'm also very pleased to introduce two commentators for today's talk. We have Professor Richard Cullen, a visiting professor at University of Hong Kong. And he was previously a professor in the Department of Business Law and Taxation at Monash University in Australia. And we also have Jack Cronkey, my colleague and associate professor here at the law school at the University of Hong Kong, who joined our faculty in 2018. And he used to be a professor at FGV Sao Paulo School of Law. Now, I think Anthea experienced some slight technical problems. She was going to come back in a couple of minutes. Nicolas, would you want to kick off?
Yes, Andrea. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to share our presentation here. Can you see the presentation well? Wonderful. So this project goes back to 2015 and 2016, when the world as we knew it as international economic lawyers came crashing down. You may remember that at the time in Europe, there were massive demonstrations in the streets against the TTIP and CETA agreements. Then in 2016, we had the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, and we had the election of Donald Trump to the presidency. And for many in the international economic law world who were assuming that we essentially were on a more or less steady path towards further liberalization, the world changed fundamentally. And suddenly we had these narratives which had been kind of at the margins of the debate about globalization coming to the fore and attaining political power in important countries of the Western world. Our objective in writing this book was, on the one hand, to understand these new narratives that were coming to the fore and understand how they relate to each other. But it was also in conscious attempt to take a different approach than what we saw as the dominant approach that was adopted by our colleagues in the discipline towards these new challenger narratives, because that dominant approach was really quite dismissive. It was very much focused on pointing out the economic illiteracy and wrong-headedness of these narratives, and there wasn't a genuine attempt to understand the stories that the proponents of these new movements were telling, that were resonating so much with large parts of the population, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom. And so what we tried to do in this project initially was to take a step back and try to map the debate and understand the relationship between the different narratives. And it was Anthea who came up with this metaphor for our undertaking, which was this idea that, well, we have all these different arguments flying around. They're like the different colors on a Rubik's Cube, and it's all a terrible mess. And our first job in this book is to unscramble this cube and identify the different narratives, so we have a clearer picture of what belongs where. So what are these 6 different narratives that we discuss in the book? The first one is the one that everyone who has studied international economic law, international economics in the post-Cold War period grew up with. And we call it the establishment narrative, because it's really the narrative that you would find promoted by the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, but also most mainstream parties in Western countries. And the idea here is basically that we're all going to benefit from globalization. Yes, some people are going to win more initially, and we show this with these arrows here. Yeah, the elites are going to maybe win more. The owners of capital are going to win more, but ultimately, what globalization does, it creates a bigger pie, and so we can all be better off. We can all get a bigger slice. There's a convenient division of labor here for these international organizations promoting the narrative, because the messy distributive issues, they're mostly left for domestic politics. So the idea is globalization is used to grow the pie, and then domestic politicians have to figure out how to distribute the spoils. And that also led to a central recommendation when there was something wrong with globalization. The problem was that there wasn't enough done to facilitate adjustment to the changes brought by trade and technological change. The second narrative that we looked at is, we call it the left-wing populist one, which doesn't really contest that globalization has the potential to increase wealth overall, but it draws attention to the fact that the vast majority of that wealth is being appropriated by the top 1%. And so you think of people like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren in the United States, or Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom, who say, well, the problem is that since the late 1970s, early 1980s, we have this gulf opening up between the productivity gains that are being generated by globalization and the wages that the average worker gets. And the reason is not so much that we haven't been redistributing enough, it's that the economy is rigged to channel the gains to the top 1%. A second narrative, which obviously was very prominent at the time, is what we call the right-wing populist narrative, or sometimes we call it the protectionist narrative. And that also draws attention to the distributive effects of globalization, but it focuses on a different relationship. It doesn't so much say, like the left-wing populists, that the elite have appropriated all the gains at the expense of the working classes, but rather it says that the elite has allowed foreigners, the Chinese, the Mexicans, to steal the jobs, the good jobs that the domestic working class used to have. And these has had a profound impact on these workers who've lost their jobs, but also on their communities. And what's central to this narrative is this idea that that the truly good jobs are manufacturing jobs, and those are the jobs that have been lost. And there's this idea that these jobs are like property. They're owned by the working classes in the West, and when they are shipped overseas, when they're offshored, it's like they have been stolen. Right? That's the rhetoric that Trump used to employ, and it has profound effects not just on the workers but also on their communities. Because once these manufacturing jobs disappear, the entire community gets sucked into a black hole, and that's as a result of that we have these deaths of despair in the United States, especially, where people in their middle age are dying by suicide, alcohol, and opioid addictions. So on this view, globalization has been terrible because of this redistribution from the working classes in the Western world towards the working classes in the emerging economies. Another view that was also rising at the time, and Anthea was really at the forefront of putting this on the radar, on the map, was the idea that who's winning from globalization is not really just particular classes within a country. There are certain countries that are winning at the expense of other countries. And the foremost example here is, of course, the rise of China compared to the rise of the United States. And by looking at this picture of globalization, not so much through the lens of the absolute gains that all countries are reaping from globalization, but through the lens of relative gains that some countries are accruing at the expense of other countries, some of the fundamental assumption underlying the establishment narrative were put on their head. So, for example, the establishment narrative has this fundamental idea that trade leads to peace, right? And so if we've been following the news and trying to understand, well, why was Germany so happy to integrate with Russia and rely on Russian gas? Well, the idea here was, well, if we trade with Russia, it will make Russia more peaceful. And the geoeconomic narrative says, no, that's actually the wrong way to think about it. We need to have peace in order to responsibly engage in trade, in order to responsibly engage in accept international economic interdependence. Because if we're internationally economically interdependent with a country that we cannot trust, and again, the relationship between Europe and Russia right now is a great example of that, then we make ourselves vulnerable, right? And we become dependent and are not able to to escape blackmail from that particular country. The fourth narrative, which was particularly prominent in those demonstrations in Europe in 2015, but also during the debates about the renegotiation of NAFTA in North America, is what we call the corporate power narrative, which says that we can't really understand who wins and loses from globalization if we look at classes within a particular country. We have to look at the working classes and the corporations transnationally. And one example of illustrating that is if we look at, for example, what happens if a company offshores jobs. For the establishment narrative, that's all good because everybody is focusing on what they do most efficiently and everybody's going to be better off as a result. For the protectionist narratives, it's the workers in the developed countries that are losing when the jobs are offshored, and the workers in developing countries that are winning because they gain the new jobs. For the corporate power narratives, it's actually somewhat different. Workers in both countries are losing because what happens when these jobs are offshored is the good jobs from the West, from Canada and the US, they become shitty jobs in, excuse my language, in Mexico, in China. They are minimum wage jobs which don't really pay the workers fairly for the productivity. And the gains in that process that are generated in that process, they're all appropriated by the corporations that are shipping the jobs overseas. Other iterations of this narrative, they also emphasize the increasing protection of intellectual property rights, of investments that are embodied in international economic agreements, and really say, well, it's really the corporations that are winning, everybody else is losing. The final narrative says that if we focus on the distribution of economic gains from globalization, we're really missing the boat. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic while the entire boat is going under. And what is the boat here? Well, it's our economic systems that are driving us onto an unsustainable path. The most famous example, of course, is the climate crisis. We are generating over more carbon emissions that go hand in hand with our increasing wealth, and that's unsustainable. And ultimately, we're all going to lose. Some are going to lose the most. The poor and developing countries are going to lose the most, but ultimately, we're all going to lose. As we were working on the book, there was a second example that came to the fore, which was the COVID-19 pandemic, which is another example that showed if we don't attend to our interconnections, to our interdependence, and are aware of make sure that we have resilient supply chains and resilient systems, then we're also all gonna lose. And of course, the pandemic is a great example of that. And we call that the global threats narrative. So if we take a bird's eye view on these narratives, how do they relate? We have at the top the win-win establishment view. Globalization is great. Then we have different narratives fighting over the spoils. We call them win-lose narratives. And at the bottom, we have the lose-lose narrative that says that we're essentially all in the same boat and all going to lose out if we don't change our economic systems. We also see these narratives represented in the news. So in The Economist often is very cheerful about the global economy, as you can see in this cover. It's also been drawing attention to the divide between the rich and the rest, taking on board some of the left-wing populist ideas. Obviously, in the wake of Donald Trump's election, there was a lot of attention paid to the so-called left behind from globalization, though we want to emphasize that the proponents of this narratives don't necessarily see themselves as left behind. They fear that the world has gone in the wrong direction and they wanted to go back in to its old ways. We have so many Economist covers on the competition between China and the United States, reflecting the geoeconomic narrative. We have increasing concern about corporate concentration, particularly in the United States, but also in China, of course. And finally, there are so many covers on the climate crisis and the coronavirus pandemic, exemplifying the global threats narrative. So I don't know whether Anthea has returned.
Yes, I have. Can you hear me?
Okay, wonderful. Yes.
Okay, great. So sorry about that, some technical glitches. So lovely to join you. And so now that we've got the 6 faces of globalization that we've put on the cube, I think one of the questions to ask is, what can you do with this analysis? And so we're going to walk you through some examples of what we do with this analysis. So the first example is something we call strategic switching. And one example we want to use here actually comes from the very famous elephant graph from Branko Milanovic. And in this elephant graph that we're showing here, this shows the percentage change in real income of different percentile people around the world. And it's the percentage gain in real income between 1988 and 2008. So these are the two decades of high globalization. And what you can see here is that some people in this period, for example, at points 1 and point 3 have really surged ahead, whereas the people down at point 2 who are in the 80th percentile, so they're fairly rich for the world as a whole, but they've not gone forward at all in this time. And so how can we start to understand something like the elephant graph through different narratives? And this was something that really came to the fore for us in the 2016 election. So you take, for example, the right-wing populist narrative espoused by Donald Trump, and he really looked at these people at point 2, and these people at point 2 very strongly sort of coincide with people who are at the less well-off end of the developed countries. So in global terms, they're still doing fairly well, but they're not doing well within that top 20% of the developed countries. And he sort of said to those in the Rust Belt, those in manufacturing communities, those who are left behind, I hear your pain, and you know who's made a killing at your expense? It's those people at point 1. Now, who are the people in point 1? So they're people in about the 50th percentile of income, so roughly the middle class of the world. Many of those are the emerging middle class we see in Asia, in India, in Mexico, and places like that, who, when there was manufacturing offshoring from the developed West to these areas, they really use that to sort of fuel the growth of their population and GDP and create this emerging middle class. So this becomes like an inter-country right-wing populist hostility. But we saw a very, very different narrative coming out from Bernie Sanders, for example. So Bernie Sanders looked at the same people at point 2, Nicolas. But if we go on to the next slide, what we see is that he doesn't fault the workers in India or China for this. He says, no, really, who you need to focus on are the people at point 3. So who are the people at point 3? Well, they are the richest of the rich, the top 1%, the billionaires. And so he sort of says, if you want to see who's been making a killing on your behalf, at your expense, it's really these people. And this sort of shift between these two narratives, I think, can be captured quite nicely on the elephant graph. But what we also see is that the underlying metric that you use can show something really different. So the last one where we had the elephant graph, that used relative gain. So what percentage gain have you made over that period? Whereas this is exactly the same graph, but done in absolute gains. And what we see here is at the 80th percentile, that small dip, you can virtually not see it. At the 50th, 60th, that had been the head of the elephant and had gone ahead so much, you also can't really see it. But the huge gains have been at the top. And that's because if you're in the middle of the income distribution, say you're earning $50 a day and you go to $100 a day, that's more than, that's a 100% relative income increase. But in terms of absolute gains, it's only $50. Whereas if you're doing an 85% increase and you're in the top 1%, that is a massive absolute gain income. And this was one of the ones where we started to think it makes a huge difference what metrics you use in telling your different stories. We also became much more aware of how particular actors were strategically switching between narratives. So one example, and there are many examples, but one example was when Zuckerberg was taken before Congress to testify about Facebook's corporate power. And a photographer, a journalist actually was able to photograph his notes before he went in. And on it, it said, if they ask you about breaking up Facebook, say you can't do that because China will win. All right, so what's happening here? Here we see that he is being brought before Congress on a corporate power narrative. And there's the idea that Congress is going to be the guardian of the little guy against this big corporate power, Facebook. And this is obviously not a great narrative for Facebook. So what he wants to do is he wants to switch the narrative to this international geoeconomic competition. There's a battle for technological supremacy. It's Team US against Team China. And on Team US, the US regulator, US companies, and US citizens are all in it together to battle this authoritarian nationalist power of China. Now, once we get this sort of competition going on, then we start to see scientists around the world being horrified by this geoeconomic narrative of it's us against them, because they want to say that instead of it being us against them, all of us, we all suffer from these global threats like pandemics and like climate change. And if we engage in these divisive us-them battles, we're not going to be able to deal with our common collective global threats like climate change, where we're all in it together. So this is just a sampling of some of the different ways in which we can understand strategic switching between narratives.
So I mentioned at the beginning that we use the metaphor of a Rubik's Cube to describe the first part of the book, where we really try to pick apart these different narratives. But as we go into later stages, we ask ourselves, well, what can we really do with these narratives once we have identified them? And at that point, the Rubik's Cube wasn't helping us that much to make sense of the task here. And instead, we stumbled on a different toy, namely the Kaleidoscope, to explain how we can use these narratives once we have identified them. And what we do in the second part of the book is to use a lot of Venn diagrams to show overlaps between different narratives, and also to show how one issue looks differently through the lens of different narratives. And we just want to give you a brief example, which actually arose after we finished the book. So you've all heard about the semiconductor shortage, and which has been in the news. And of course, there are many different causes. But what's been striking is that there's a strong consensus in many key economies, the United States, in Europe, for example, on a particular policy solution, which is to reshore semiconductor manufacturing. The US has allotted 50 billion to that, the European Union 20 billion, but there's probably more to come. What explains this strong consensus? Well, one thing we can do with the narrative is to see, well, how do they relate to this? And what's striking about this policy solution is that it actually is in an area of overlap between three narratives. So one reason why you might want to reshore semiconductor manufacturing is that you want to bring the jobs back. And that was, of course, the key for Donald Trump and for the right-wing populist narrative. There's a general objective to bring manufacturing back. And that was one of the goals for Trump. That's why he imposed, in fact, tariffs on semiconductors from China during the trade war. But you could also favor reshoring for a completely different reason, namely that you are concerned about the resilience of your economy. And this came to the fore, particularly in Europe. Europeans would never step forward and say, well, the European Union would never step forward and say, well, we want to bring the jobs here. But the Europeans got really concerned when some of the car factories were suddenly no longer able to produce because they didn't have enough semiconductors. And so you might support this policy objective for the reason because you're concerned about the availability of essential supplies, which was the main reason for the Europeans. But there's also a third perspective, which is, again, very, very, very prominent in the United States, but also increasingly in Europe, which says that we simply cannot rely on our strategic competitors to be a supply of chips. And we also cannot rely, for example, on Taiwan as the production location for the most advanced chips, because it is in a geostrategically vulnerable position. And therefore, we need to bring chips production back in order to prevail or prevail in this geoeconomic competition. So that's one example of how different narratives can form an overlapping consensus on a particular policy. But once we have these narratives mapped out in this way, we also see that there are other policy options that differ depending on which narrative we subscribe to. So for the geoeconomic narrative and the global threats narrative concerned about resilience, there's also the alternative of ally shoring. You don't necessarily have to bring the jobs back. You can also, it's okay if if the production happens in trusted allies, which is something that doesn't make any sense for the right-wing populist narrative, which is really concerned not about control over manufacturing outputs, but rather is concerned about the jobs themselves.
So let me switch modes here a little bit. And up until now, we've been talking very much about economic globalization. But I now want to ask a sort of a different order question, which is, what kind of project is this? And this is a project of what psychologists would call integrative complexity. So if you look at the next slide, Nicolas, if we go to the next one and sort of think about the nature of this particular project, this is one where we have disaggregated into 6 different narratives and located them in a particular order on cubes. How does that tie with the work of psychologists on integrative complexity? Well, basically, psychologists say that people have very, very different levels of integrative complexity. Some people tend to see a particular situation only through one lens in a very black and white way, whereas other people tend to have high integrative complexity, which really involves 2 different things. The first is that they're able to differentiate. So they're able to see a complex problem like economic globalization, not through one narrative with black and white approaches, but from many different perspectives, and to understand that there are many different shades of grey and that many different perspectives might have something positive or useful to say, even if they don't have the whole truth. And so the first part of this project of differentiating between these different narratives is a first step in integrative complexity. But the second step is an ability not just to see from different perspectives, but to work out ways to try to integrate these perspectives back together. And so one way we do that, for example, is by integrating them back onto the 6 sides of the Rubik's Cube with the win-win, win-lose, and lose-lose narratives. But part of the work we're also starting to do with the Venn diagrams and some of the work we're doing since publishing the book is really about thinking about different frameworks for integrating different perspectives, because I think that's very much where we're going in trade policy. And when you do that, you need to think very strongly about not just commonalities and differences, but where things are incommensurable between the different narratives. One way metaphorically we like to talk about this approach to integrative complexity is that we like to see complex problems like globalization, we like to see them through dragonfly eyes. So why do we say that? Well, so humans actually have 2 eyes, and we integrate the vision from those 2 eyes to create our bifocal vision. That's what gives us 3-dimensional vision. But dragonflies take this to a whole other level, as you can see here. Basically, they have 2 composite eyes that have thousands and thousands of different lenses in them. And it's by integrating all of those different lenses to come up with a more holistic picture that dragonflies are actually able to get an almost 360-degree view of reality. And so an approach to integrative complexity is really an approach about trying to see complex problems through dragonfly eyes. Now, for some people, this sounds like an absolute nightmare. To try and keep all of that complexity in your head. But there are other ways to build this into our understanding through teams, through diverse teams rather than diverse perspectives within a head. And we use this particular graphic from Said because I think it illustrates it nicely, that if you were to think about getting a particular expert on a topic with a sort of circle of expertise and experience, here we've got David. And then you were to think about building a team of equally qualified and respectable people like David, Andrew, John, Toby, Nathan, Jacob, Jeremy, Theodore, and Ben. All of these individuals could be very smart and very well suited to a particular job. But if you hire people that have very similar cognitive styles and very similar backgrounds, then they're probably going to overlap in their different perspectives, which both sort of reinforces their biases, but also means you just don't have coverage of different ways of understanding the world and different perspectives. If you actually want to get traction on a complex problem, you need a much more distributed approach where you need to think not just about smart individuals, but about smart teams that have cognitive diversity of different backgrounds. And so this is the last point that we'd like to end on in this talk. And it's particularly fitting that we'll be doing this here in Hong Kong, which is we have very strongly raised this particular approach as different narratives within the Western world. But what we want to say is that the central underlying idea here is the importance of seeing complex problems and seeing them through different eyes. And this is something that we have done within the West, but it's also really important to understand that these different narratives may be replicated elsewhere around the globe, but there may also be other narratives that are stronger in other parts of the globe. And so we do this here through different eyes with a picture of the globe to make us much more conscious that when we think about global issues, we need to be thinking about diverse perspectives from outside the West as well. Nicolas, are we going to do any on the non-Western, or are we at time and we should leave it there? And
I think in the interest of time, we should leave it here, but we might come back later if it comes up in the discussion.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
Thank you, Anthea and Nicolas. That was fascinating and thought-provoking. And I think that you definitely win the hearts of the audience at Hong Kong you're here. And I do think the success of this book helped educate, and enlighten a lot of people about the complexity of globalization, because a lot of what we learn, mostly is from our own local media, which tends to be biased, whether you are in the US or in the East. And now let me give the floor to our 2 distinguished discussants. First, I will invite Professor Richard Cullen to give his comments and feedback.
Well, hello, many thanks for the invitation. Can you all hear me okay? Good. I had a bit of trouble with the Zoom link on a previous presentation. Firstly, thank you to Anthea and Nicolas for the excellent presentation and also for the stimulating and influential new book. I'm grateful to you, Anthea, for finishing on that different eyes point, because the few comments I've got to make actually fit within that category, I think. You can see how very impressive the research this book is. But I, from my point of view at least, you can also see that it does have a strong Eurocentric anchor. This is not surprising, I think, and it's evident in the presentation today that many of those who are leading the debates you talk about are from the Western world, and influential discussions have been played out vigorously across the general and academic media based in the West, like The Economist, which we saw pop up several times. I've argued recently how the still critically dominant Western media, and especially the English language media, evolved from the age of colonial imperialism, which in turn was ultimately a product of the way the Renaissance fostered Europe's transition from the Middle Ages into an era of remarkable intellectual rediscovery. The extraordinary reach and durability of the British Empire and the transition from British to American global supremacy has cemented the role of English as the leading language used to advance and interpret the primary ways in which very many people still see the world today, and globalisation, I would argue. This is not bad in itself, of course, but mainstream Anglo media outlets enjoy inordinate shaping power. And two questions arise for me at this point. First, how far has this power shaped our basic understanding of the varied globalization narratives which we've just been discussing today? And next, how far will this continue to be the case over coming decades? Let me note here one reason why I think the long-term wind direction may be set to change. Hisham Babani's latest book, Why the 21st Century Will Be an Asian One, explains how the entire Asian group of countries in the UN had a combined GDP which ranked third behind the US and Europe in 2000. But by 2020, this same Asian group had moved into first place. Babani also notes that PricewaterhouseCoopers expects that the top 5 economies worldwide by 2050, measured by purchasing power parity, will be in order: China, India, America, Indonesia, and Brazil. That is, 3 of these top economies will be Asian. Babani also adds some central comment directly related to the role of the Western media. First, although economic power has shifted east, no Asian publication can match the global reach of the New York Times, Financial Times, BBC, and so on. After acknowledging the excellence of these outlets, he then emphasizes that they are conceptually shaped by a deeply rooted Western ideology, which explains why they struggle to explain Asian reality. He concludes rather robustly that the Anglo-Saxon media are behaving like the feudal lords of the past, clinging on to their old privileges whilst denying a new reality. A second or further question which this discussion raises for me is what might be the current Chinese face of globalization. I'm sure that you have looked at this yourselves, but let me just add my 2 cents worth here for what it's worth. My concern here is to move beyond the contentious debate about democracy versus authoritarianism and give some impressions of what I think are some key elements in one important Chinese view of globalization. And I'm relying here significantly on my reading in translation of the work of the Politburo Standing Committee member Wang Huning, who is widely viewed as China's most powerful intellectual. A recent analysis of his influence stressed that his insights into how to secure socialism against the forces of globalization is what has made him so influential. My limited reading varies, not radically, but significantly. I think Wong is very concerned about that possibility of Western liberal thinking having an adverse effect on the stability of China and the stability and confidence of the Chinese Communist Party, or CPC. But he's also fundamentally committed to a comprehensive modernisation of China and the CPC, and that modernisation is premised on China operating within a maximally globalised trading world, albeit one where China gets to control and shape certain aspects and institutions. This is a globalisation that's aimed at building and securing the Chinese dream and a better world in which China can trade and engage. I think it's true that China wants a rules-based international order, but one where China has an increasing say in shaping and interpreting the rules and in management of these international institutions. In its own way and in its own interest, and Beijing would say in the world's interest, China is committed to supporting a globalised world. So I'm wondering how this particular Chinese face of globalisation may reshape over time important aspects of the fundamental framework and operational procedures which have just been introducing us to today of the contemporary globalisation regime. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for your very insightful feedback. And now I will give the floor to Jack.
Okay, thank you, Anthea. All right, it's a pleasure to give comments on this book, and I do recommend it to people, and in part because my comments aren't going to focus on the narratives themselves, but my reaction to the book. In large part, when you read through it, it really provides a model, and I think you get this at the latter part of the presentation, about how to engage in a world of hyperpolarized debates as a public intellectual, of which many law professors aspire to be, and find a way of making a constructive contribution and take other viewpoints seriously to develop this other term, which I didn't necessarily see in the presentation, but it's in the book, about cognitive empathy, right? You have to understand your interlocutors in order to find some sort of common ground. And so the diagnostic function of the narratives of finding these sort of overlaps sort of is in this sort of hopeful sort of common ground type of approach. So I think we might have some disagreement. So I'm going to sort of make it a little bit sort of a harder version of my reaction about how idealistic this is, right? As a project, as sort of like finding the dragonfly sort of model for ourselves. So when I imagine, and you mentioned this idea of trade policy, when I read the book, I thought about who your audience was. And in there, I thought about earnest trade lawyers sitting across the table from each other with specific issues to negotiate. And they're really trying to find that Venn diagram overlap, right? To a certain degree, even if they have, superiors, they're bargaining in good faith to try to find a solution, right? And this also is at the heart of some of these sort of ideas that are very popular among trade lawyers, right? That part of this sort of ethos is something that does depress military conflict, not just by economic integration, but providing these venues where this type of honest engagement can have. What this also made me think about was another project that looked at law and psychology in similar ways. 20 years ago, Dan Kahan and Don Brennan, who were criminal law theorists, developed their cultural cognition project. This project was sort of inspired by Kahan's idealism around the French abortion compromise. He was able to see how in France, a certain sort of intransigent debate was sort of brokered by looking in similar ways about the cultural schemas that framed how people thought about abortion, right, in a sense. And for 20 years, they've been developing research on this sort of, on this topic. But what's happened after 20 years is, even though they had that initial, inspiration by the French abortion compromise and a few other things, their research keeps showing how deep polarization goes and maybe how extensive it's getting. They look at guns, they look at jury trials, in lots of different areas of the law. Coming up with solutions has been difficult. And one of the things that emerged out of that is that worldviews aren't just explanatory, right? But they're tied to power and they're tied to political mobilization. So to create a new alliance isn't a purely intellectual enterprise, right? It requires engaging with social movements. So I think this gets into a lot of the specific sort of topics that the book touches on a great deal, where you can see some potential possibilities, but then you have to think through who's going to actually be making these sort of overlaps a reality. Right. As a labor person, I think in the book, labor comes up a lot with globalization. It is a recurrent issue. But one of the things is that people may even actually agree about the same problem and not even have a different explanation, but because of the sort of frame that they come from, have a different solution. And it's as important that the solution work, because it represents a particular way of looking at the world, as the explanation, right? And I think in the current global context, we've seen that material insecurity on these particular issues sometimes even makes people more susceptible to sort of emotive answers that sort of reify those biases. But in the current context, I think one of the great successes of the book is looking at the US-China relationship and showing the ways in which viewing others through our frames really limits the conversation. Right? It very much shows that it limits these sort of into these sort of nationalist frames that avoids looking at the commonalities. Right? The US and China are part of a relatively integrated global order. Right? And both countries are having a crisis of presentation, right? They're struggling about how to frame globalization. Right? So in the US, right, the downplay of the establishment frame has led to a lot of conversations about, is elite framing enough, right? Or have elites betrayed us by coming up with what they saw as one of these types of solutions? So you see recurrently now people say like, well, we might have sold to the public the idea that China's admissions to the WTO was going to help liberalize China, but we're all very sophisticated and we actually didn't believe that ourselves. But in admitting that, right, creates even further distrust. Right? And in China, you see the rhetoric around common prosperity. Another place that's sort of struggling around like the way that globalization was explained domestically in China, right, is something that is shifting, right? And it's not as satisfactory as it was before. But at the same time, I start to think through the same thing about implementation. Right. So a few weeks ago, we had Tom Ginsburg here presenting his new book about democracies and international law. I'm making a strong argument that democracies relate to international law differently. And this raises the question of, can we even think about these issues about how to work as public intellectuals or frame these ideas outside of models of government? Right? The word democracy and authoritarianism things don't come up in the book very often, but when it actually comes to framing and passing solutions right on the ground, if we're outside of the realm of the trade negotiators, these things become quite different. And one of the things that Richard touches on is that in this various parts of the world, ethno-nationalism and post-colonialism have really started to resist things largely on tropes of cultural globalization. And these become very local arguments about identity. So if we're thinking about, there would be a way of cooperating on climate change or other forms of interdependence, it really raises the question of whether or not the domestic audiences, right, that elites have to speak to, and this type of intellectual work is elite work, would be receptive to this, right, given this sort of these sort of new framing. And so I think that the last thing, just to, because it's everyone's mind, I think that the invasion in the Ukraine is making people really think a lot about the social and political conditions that allowed us to think about globalization as a cooperative sort of enterprise and really look at some of the material conditions that underline it. So there's a lot there sort of that might seem more cynical, but I think the thing that's still very powerful about the book is that it really frames like, what's the alternative to this type of what I would call idealism, right? If you're trying to construct arguments and engagement, you can simply say, well, we're going to sort of look at the power dynamics and sort of play to what sort of goes to the audience, but really trying to come up with something new that might kind of come up with better solutions. I think they do successfully lay out some, what I would call sort of best practices for academic self-analysis, right? If you're really going to engage with these things seriously, there are a lot of things as individual academics and intellectuals that you need to engage in so that you don't continue to spin your wheels with some of the same sort of critiques that you might have of popular culture more broadly. So I know that's, there's a lot more to say, but I'll sort of keep it there. And I really sort of encourage, especially since I see so many of our students and young scholars in the frame of thinking about the book and looking at it that way as two very sort of well-accomplished and sophisticated academics still working through some of these issues for themselves and maybe relate that to some of the challenges that you're thinking about in your own work. That's it.
Thank you, Jet. And now I will give the floor to Nicolas and Anthea to respond.
Great. Well, they were just two such wonderful sets of comments. And one of the commonalities between the two of them is actually sort of at the question mark of what do these narratives look like outside the West? And we have a section in the book, it was actually originally 4 chapters, but for publishing reasons got condensed to 1, looking at blind spots and biases within the Western debates, where we looked at some of the narratives that are more prominent outside the West. But one of the things that we've also done since writing the book is to think more particularly about the Chinese situation. And given that both commentators referred to this idea of like, what are the sort of Chinese approaches, we just wanted to give you a sneak preview of some of this work. So one of the ways we like to think about this is through thinking about our narratives, not through a game of noughts and crosses, but through a game of hockey sticks and crosses. And these are images that are very commonly associated with the different narratives. So the first one is the hockey stick of economic growth that we see from the Industrial Revolution, where for centuries and centuries, there was almost no economic growth. And then suddenly we see it absolutely shoot up. And that's as a function of a specialization, of trade, of technology. And this kind of hockey stick of economic growth is really one that we often see associated with the establishment narrative. But the interesting thing about that hockey stick of growth is that there is another hockey stick of growth that we also need to be aware of, and that's the hockey stick of the climate emissions. So just as we've seen this extraordinary exponential rise of economic growth, we've also seen this extraordinary exponential rise of carbon emissions. And that one, I think, is a graphic that's very commonly associated with the lose-lose narrative down the bottom. Whereas what we see on the left and the right, the middle, the win-lose ones, are often not hockey sticks, but are crosses, where we see kind of comparative advantage between two different groups changing. So for example, one graphic that would go very clearly with the sort of the left-wing populist, but also the corporate power, is this concern about inequality. And so here, for example, you see it in a cross of the bottom 50% going down and the top 1% going up. And that one would sort of be on the more left-leaning sides of criticisms about economic globalization. But on the right, you would also see a cross-type figure that comes up fairly commonly. But this one, instead of being fundamentally concerned about inequality, it's often about inter-country competition. And so one of the cross graphs that you'll often see there is, for example, this one where you see the share of the world economy by the US going down and the share by China going up. And again, you see this change in relative gains. And so as we started to kind of conceptualize this hockey sticks and crosses, one of our question marks has been like, how do you see China here? And interestingly, in China, you see all of these narratives playing out and more. So for example, when President Xi goes to Davos and talks about China's commitment to economic globalization and the fact that it brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, those hundreds of millions of people were largely in Asia and many of them in China. And so you can really see that as a very strong statement of support for the win-win understanding of economic globalization that is the establishment narrative. At the same stage, and our commentators were absolutely right about this, you're seeing turmoil in the domestic debates where we're starting to see a pushback against the economic model and economic globalization, much like we're seeing in the US. And so whereas in the US, you're concerned about inequality and corporate power, in China, we're seeing the common prosperity idea, which is very much also about the inequality, but we're also seeing the pushback against corporate power, and no one can better describe this than our moderator, with the crackdown on big tech in China. And so you can see that debate is playing out in China and affecting China. On the other hand, on the sort of geoeconomic side, we see a very similar argument coming up in this interstate competition, but we see it from a different perspective. And it's incredibly ironic, I guess, to be presenting this today, because one of the narratives that we look at in the book is the against Western hegemony narrative that's based on more of an alliance between Russia and China. And it is so clear at the moment that we're starting to see this conflict between, for example, China's support for the win-win analysis and its support for this sort of against Western hegemony, its other side of the geoeconomic analysis that we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine, Russia. Finally, and this picks up on the Belt and Road argument, is we also see China saying very much that we are the provider of global goods. And one of the global goods that China is a provider of is global infrastructure through the BRI, but another is the way it has done vaccine diplomacy, creating vaccines and bringing them to other parts of the world. And that is really sort of stepping in to say we're one of the essential countries in dealing with some of the lose-lose situations. The reason that I raise this here is just to try to illustrate that you can have these sorts of analyses with similar and different narratives from around the world. And it's not like there are 6 faces of globalization in the West, but one face for India and one face for China or one face for other countries. Instead, you have this multiplicity, and we see different constellations of narratives in different places. Nicolas, I might pass over to you there, because I think you will probably have particular things to say about trade policy and alliances and how to move forward.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank both of you for your comments. I'm going to focus on Jed's comments and first of all, agree completely that we are not looking, this is not a sociology of the narratives, and it's also not a guide to implementing particular policy solutions. We're not looking at where the narratives come from and what motivates them, but rather it's more a toolkit of when you're confronted with different narratives in a particular situation, how do you think about them? But I would slightly disagree with you that it's just in the realm of like trade negotiations that we find the kind of goodwill that you need in order to see this kind of engagement. We actually do think that there are certain politicians that really try to take this approach in the domestic realm as well. Like one example that we have in the book is the Biden administration, which really tried to take it on board quite a few of the critiques of trade policy from the Trump administration, for example, but also try to combine them with, of course, the global threats concern about the climate crisis, the left-wing populist concern about domestic inequality, and try to knit a coalition. And we distinguish in the book between 2 types of politicians: those who are trying to kind of write their particular narrative write really hard by mobilizing their base and relying on that, and by increasing polarization. And those who are trying to build alliances across different narratives. And we see people like Biden, or also the new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, as people in the latter mold who are really trying to bridge the divides. But I also think that in domestic political debates, such as in Canada, we just had these trucker protests in Ottawa. One of the charges that Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has to accept is that in the initial phase of the protest, he was more taking a polarizing stance, right? And so some said, well, he should have talked to the truckers, maybe not even that far, but he clearly did try to polarize, and that's politically dangerous, I think. And so I'm not sure that it's just in the context of trade negotiations or even for academics that this kind of approach of cognitive empathy has merit. It's also, I think, for certain types of politicians, it's a very important skill. But I'll leave it at that and see whether there are any further comments and questions from the floor.
Thank you, Nicolas and Anthea. At this stage, I would like to open up the floor for Q&A from our audience. And we have one question here. In President Xi's narrative of building a human community with shared future, a globalization narrative, is that a globalization narrative?
Look, I'll come in on this one and say that I think it is. I think when you think about the different narratives, one of the differences is to think about kind of what's the sort of unit of analysis, and what's in common between the win-win analysis and the lose-lose analysis is they obviously, one's positive and one's negative, but what's in common with them is that they both have a sense of everyone together can win, or everyone together can lose. And I think part of what we see with President Xi is he's trying to sort of say there isn't a question of China winning and others losing, that we're all human, that there's something common for all of us together, and we can all come together in these sorts of ways for peace, for prosperity. And so I think it can be that sort of a globalization narrative. And one of the really interesting things, I think, would be to look not just at Chinese narratives and Western narratives, but very much to look at kind of other countries in Asia and other countries in places like Africa, about how are they developing their own narratives and responses to these different things. So are they, for example, seeing Chinese investment as this really positive kind of leading dragon as opposed to leading goose way of economic development, or are they seeing it as sort of another wave of colonialism, but this time with a Chinese face? And one of the interesting things, and this really goes to Professor Cullen's point, is that we don't have nearly as much access to many of those domestic narratives, either because they don't have a strong media presence there, or even if they do have media presence, it just doesn't have the global diffusion and reach. There's something extraordinarily asymmetrical and hierarchical about different media relationships. And that makes it much harder to understand perspectives around the world, but I think also makes it particularly difficult for the West to understand what are the views in other parts of the world, because many other parts of the world are very used to hearing and understanding a Western perspective and can compare it with what they see domestically and say, this is similar, this is not similar. But I think many in the West just don't have that experience. And so it's much easier to think that their view is the only view, is the right view.
Yeah, I have to say that Richard is probably one of the rare Western voices that often defend China's perspective, and to which I very much appreciate. I do think we need a diversity of opinion here, and I do think that Anthea and Nicolas' book, the success of this book in itself, have made much progress in enlightening the rest of the world about what's happening. But based on the feedback that you receive from the two commentators, it seems that they're not satisfied yet. They want a sequel to this book about how you're going to push more to change people's perspective, given the institutional environment that they live in. And it also reminds me of Amy Chua's book about tribalism. And also with the high-tech environment that we live in, that we're so glued to a social media platform, is that our attention channel is already biased. How we're going to change this? So I do highly anticipate another further advancement of this project into what do we do about this, given the fact that we live in such a complex environment. What can we change and do that?
Just a quick comment on that. Just quickly on the social media point, because it's been so important, both like in the context of the trucker protest, but also within Ukraine war. I think it's one very practical step that you can take is to follow people who you disagree with and whose opinion you dislike, because then at least you get a sense of what it looks like from the other side. And interestingly, what happened in the course of researching this book, especially for the right-wing populist perspective, I had to do that very consciously. I had to look up people of, well, obviously we all follow Donald Trump on Twitter, but then right-wing politicians in the US, in the UK, or in Germany, and I still follow them. And I never just agree with what they say, but at least I know how the events look from their perspective. And so that's an important reality check. And so that's something very practical that every one of us can do.
And I think also, can I just say on that, I also think there's a very important point about algorithms and also our choice of media. So some of the work that Tetlock is doing now going forward is actually going to be much more about the new media environment. And you can actually have algorithms that push you to extremes, which would push you to proponents of different narratives, but you could also have algorithms that actually push you towards people who have integrative complexity or have super forecasting kind of powers, who exercise a dragonfly view. There are different ways of doing that, and part of it's going to be a business model. But I think one of the other things to think about in our own consumption is how do we want to engage? So one of the things I found the process, just like with Nicolas, it really helped to change my view on a number of the narratives, and it made me much more sympathetic to narratives that I had not initially liked, and much more critical of narratives that I had initially liked. So it had a really interesting kind of moderating effect. But one of the other effects of the book for me has been that we had to follow social media a lot during the writing of this book. And having submitted and published the book, I'm just not following social media in the same way at all anymore, and doing much more following of reading books and from different perspectives and different disciplines, because it's a very different kind of medium. And I think that you do start to reflect a bit the mediums that you engage in. And Ezra Klein has some really beautiful podcasts on this, that he feels like he is a better public commentator when he does podcasts than when he does things on Twitter. And so he tries to do less on Twitter.
Yeah, I do think that your book also have implications for Chinese policymakers as to how they improve the soft power and image building in the Western world. And obviously, so far they haven't done a really good job. Yeah, I do think that this book should sell to the Chinese audience, policymakers, Chinese students of globalization. And I'm really grateful that Anthea and Nicolas can come and talk to us about this book. And I think we are exactly on time. And I would like to thank Jack and Richard for spending your precious time reading through the book. I gave them the assignment to read the book, to be the commentator, and really appreciate that. And I appreciate the audience coming. And thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for having us. Thanks for
Thank
the
you very
comments.
much for having us.
Yeah.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
See you.